Robert Redford, who passed away on September 16, 2025, leaving fans around the world struggling to recover from the loss, was the quiet light of Hollywood who spent more than 7 decades earning admiration as an actor, respect as an Oscar-winning director, and reverence as the founder of Sundance, the sacred refuge that forever changed independent cinema. He was born on August 18, 1936, in Santa Monica to Charles and Martha Redford, growing up beneath the lingering shadow of the Great Depression in a small home where dreams were cheaper than comfort and every wish was weighed against the price of bread. And when polio struck him at age 10, the world of games and laughter turned into long sterile nights where disinfectant burned the air and dread pressed on his chest like stone. But his mother Martha refused to let him give up, massaging his stiffened legs night after night until they trembled back to life, whispering courage into the boy who would one day teach the world that resilience is carved from deprivation and refusal. By his teenage years, that pain had hardened into rebellion as he wandered the streets of Los Angeles chasing danger to feel alive, drifting into the wrong company and brushing against the law until his father's stern steady hand pulled him back from the edge, and he turned to art and movement, sketching faces he'd never met and swinging a tennis racket, even briefly warming up tennis legend Pancho Gonzalez. Then in 1955, when he was just 18, tragedy struck when his mother, who had nursed his crippled body back to motion, entered surgery and never came home, dying from infection and leaving the house in Van Nuys silent as his father Charles buried grief behind stoic eyes and young Robert learned the cost of loss too soon, a silence that would trail him into fame and triumph for the rest of his life. A fleeting chance came with a sports scholarship to the University of Colorado, but restlessness, shame and drink took it away, and broke and disillusioned he packed his life into a suitcase and vanished across the Atlantic, wandering through France, Spain and Italy, painting to quiet hunger and walking to silence regret, before returning to New York with nothing but brushes, sketches, scars, and a vow that when pain came again he would not yield but meet it with work. At just 22, with his mother's death still bleeding in memory and the shame of a lost scholarship burning like a secret scar, he stepped into Manhattan's narrow streets with no safety net and no inheritance, only a few brushes and an aching hunger, studying painting at Pratt Institute while clinging to art as if color itself could pull him out of darkness. Before enrolling at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, where acting became survival by another name. He scraped by on small television parts in The Twilight Zone, Maverick and Perry Mason, roles so meager they barely paid rent. His first paycheck $75 leaving him with $3 after rent and food, but he kept that crumpled bill in his pocket for years as a reminder that every dollar could carry the weight of dignity. The same golden face that would one day define American cinema was at the beginning his greatest curse, as casting directors saw only symmetry not soul, calling him too pretty, too clean, too polished to believe, trapping the artist in a paradox of beauty that blinded others to the pain beneath. Then came 1963 when on Broadway in Neil Simon's Barefoot in the Park, Redford at 27 was cast opposite Elizabeth Ashley and finally stood beneath the light that revealed what he truly was, giving audiences not beauty but truth with wit, timing, and a quiet ache that critics could no longer ignore. And as applause roared each evening, he imagined his mother's face in the crowd, watching her son finally earn the right to stand tall. From Broadway the screen came calling and Hollywood opened its gates as he moved into film with performances that revealed the depth he'd fought so long to prove, and through the late 1960s and 1970s he seemed untouchable with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Sting, The Way We Were, and All the President's Men becoming chapters of American cinema itself. His films collectively earning over $1.5 billion worldwide, with The Sting alone grossing more than $159 million in 1973. Yet behind the applause stood a man still haunted by the boy who once painted through hunger, still questioning if the world loved the mask more than the man, and when The Great Gatsby faltered in 1974 despite his star power with critics tearing at him for being too golden to be tragic, he doubled down on truth with All the President's Men, a $9 million political gamble that earned over $70 million and transformed skepticism into art. In 1980 he stepped behind the camera for Ordinary People, a quiet, devastating story of grief that mirrored his own life, and though Hollywood doubted him, saying a handsome man can't understand suffering, the film cost just $6.2 million but grossed nearly $55 million and swept 4 Oscars including Best Director, and when his name was called he murmured that was for her, remembering the mother who once massaged life back into his paralyzed legs. In 1981 he poured nearly $5 million of his fortune into a barren patch of Utah soil to create a refuge he called Sundance, and though friends thought he'd lost his mind warning he'd never make that money back, for years the project bled red ink as he sold paintings and mortgaged land to keep the dream alive, saying he wanted to build a place for voices that might never be heard. And those voices came as unknown directors and first-time writers found home there, making the festival. That once lost money become a cultural empire valued at over $100 million. His personal life carried profound pain as in 1958 at just 22 he married Lola Van Wagenen, a woman of quiet brilliance who became his refuge, and together they built something the world could never photograph with their early years humble but radiant, until their firstborn Scott lived for only a few weeks, leaving the nursery they had painted with trembling joy to fall into silence. The tiny clothes lying untouched and the crib standing like an unanswered prayer. When their second son James arrived, hope flickered again, but he was born too soon with a frail body and weak lungs, enduring 2 liver transplants and countless surgeries across decades of pain. And through it all Redford lived a double life, as by day he was Hollywood's golden standard but by night he sat beside hospital beds whispering lines to a sleeping boy and bargaining with a universe that offered no bargains. Until in 2020, after nearly 6 decades of relentless endurance, James's battle ended from cancer at age 58, a cruel echo of the past that left Redford understanding that even the greatest men cannot outlive their pain. In 1985, after 27 years of marriage to Lola, the silence between them grew louder than love itself and they divorced with no scandal or betrayal, only the quiet shattering of 2 people who had once clung to each other like lifelines now drifting into separate orbits. And for Redford it was not just the end of a marriage but the collapse of the only sanctuary he had ever known. Among the souls who marked him deeply were Natalie Wood, whom he met in the early 1960s when both were still finding their footing, working side by side on Inside Daisy Clover and This Property is Condemned, and when she drowned in 1981 at just 43, it was suffocating silence as a voice gone and laughter stolen left him learning that no spotlight can chase away the dark. If Natalie's loss came like lightning, Paul Newman's death decades later was a slow eclipse, as from the moment they locked eyes on the set of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid something rare sparked, a brotherhood born not of fame but of recognition, and in 2008 when Paul passed at 83, Redford at 72 said only 7 words to the press: "There's a hole in my life now," growing quieter afterward as if every loss had taught him how to carry grief without letting it drown him. Then, as if mercy itself had waited for the right moment, came Sibylle Sagers in the late 1990s, a German-born painter who spoke the language of light rather than fame, offering him not noise but quiet, not fever but stillness, and when they married in 2009 at 73 he said it feels like a new life, a phrase that concealed half a century of endurance. Together they built more than love, as from their home in Santa Fe they created The Way of the Rain, part performance and part prayer about the earth's fragile beauty. And in Sibylle's presence the man once forged by fire finally learned to live not in fame or silence but in rain. In his final years Robert Redford moved through his days like a man quietly measuring each step against time itself as his body began to bow to the years, with lungs weakening and hands sometimes trembling with memory. Yet his mind remained clear and sharp, anchored to truth, to the land, and to Sibylle who had brought him peace after a lifetime of storms. Around him stood the empire he had built with the Sundance estate vast and golden beneath the Utah sun, the foundation that bore his name, and the films that had defined integrity for an entire era. His net worth grown to nearly $250 million, though the only wealth he counted was time spent watching desert light fade or listening to Sibylle paint in silence. Then came September 16, 2025, when the air in Sundance was thin and still and the sky stretched wide in gold over the Wasatch Peaks. And in the calm of his home surrounded by the land he had loved and protected he exhaled one last time, a breath that felt less like an ending and more like a return to the earth, his heart which had carried both triumph and sorrow simply growing still with no fanfare or stage light, only the hush of inevitability and the soft sound of wind through the pines. For Sibylle the loss was devastation beyond words, as their home once alive with color and music fell silent, and for his children Shauna, Amy and Dylan, and his grandchildren, grief returned like an old storm as they mourned not the legend but the man who had sat quietly with them in gardens teaching them the patience of soil and wind. His estate divided among his children, grandchildren, and foundations will continue the work he began, with 40% going to his children, 20% to his grandchildren through an education and nature trust, and the remaining 40% nearly $100 million to institutions that carried his spirit, including the Redford Foundation protecting art and the environment, the Sundance Institute nurturing over 15,000 independent artists across 80 countries, and the Redford Center funding environmental films across the globe. At the heart of it all stood Sundance, his mountain empire of 5,000 acres in Utah worth more than $200 million, with his will leaving one sacred request that it must never be sold, only protected, while his Santa Fe residence worth $20 million was left to Sibley, and his California oceanfront home valued around $15 million remained with his 3 surviving children. He began with $75 a week and a paintbrush and ended with a legacy worth nearly $250 million, but the true value of his life could never be measured in numbers, as his fortune was vast, but his truest inheritance lay in what he gave away: land that will remain untouched, foundations that will nurture artists long after the lights fade, and children who now carry the values he lived by, proving that greatness is not what you keep but what you give. And though the curtain has fallen, Robert Redford's light, vast as the desert and tender as the rain, will never fade.